Welcome back, guys. Today we are going to make a video that is probably long overdue. I probably should have put this video out a long time ago. I've had a handful of questions about this particular disease, and I see a lot of people asking questions on social media about different things. We're going to talk about cedar apple rust, which can be a real nemesis to some of you apple tree growers out there. So we're gonna do kind of a deep dive. If you've watched my videos, you know I like to explain how these things work so that it can put you in a position so that you can do a better job of controlling them. Okay, cedar apple rust is a relatively common fungus. It's Gymnosporangium juniperi. And I don't typically throw out these big fancy names, but there's a reason why I'm doing it in this video, because it plays a part in understanding how the disease works. And what it does is, one of the things that makes this particular fungus kind of unique is that it requires what we call an alternate host. It actually has to bounce in between two different plants in order to complete its life cycle and effectively infect either one of those plants. Cedar apple rust requires apple trees. Okay, that is like the springtime, early summer host. And it also requires, well, this is where we're going to get a little funky. And this is the part that I really want to focus on, because a lot of people have questions about this. The alternate host is cedar, hence the name cedar apple rust. If you don't take anything away from this video, this is the part that I really want to hit home on, because this is what I get a lot of questions about, is the alternate host, the cedar end of cedar apple rust. Cedar apple rust, the alternate host, as odd as this sounds, is not cedar, technically. It's actually juniper. Hence the reason why I use that big technical name, Gymnosporangium juniperi. Okay? That's the Latin name for the fungus. Its alternate host is juniper. Now, why this gets confusing sometimes is because junipers are a huge family of plants. There's thousands of different kinds of junipers. And one of them is what we quite often refer to as eastern red cedar. Or a lot of people just say cedar. I've got cedar trees in my yard. Okay, that wood that you see, that classic cedar wood that you would find in like a cedar closet or a cedar chest, and it's got those red undertones and it smells, that's not cedar, that's juniper. Technically it's Juniperus virginiana. Okay, that's what these trees that everybody calls a cedar tree is Juniperus virginiana. And that is the prime alternate host for this cedar apple rust. Okay, and the way it works is early in the springtime, right about now, it's today's, I don't know, March 20-something, 22nd or something. Usually a little bit later from here in Connecticut. When you get into your warmer weather, when you start getting around 60 degrees, you know, and your apple trees are just starting to bud out a little bit, they're starting to get little buds on them and they're starting to leaf a little bit, that fungus is hanging out on these cedar trees, these juniper trees. And then as the weather warms up a little bit and you get rain, you have to have rain for this stuff to move, it will then bounce from these cedar trees and it'll blow over onto your apple trees. And that's when it's going to infect your apple trees. Okay? And then sometime later in the year, usually maybe June-ish, something like that, late June, those spores that are on your apple tree now, they've infected your apple tree, they've put the big marks on the leaves, they've opened up, you got the little orange ring around the black spot and the whole thing. Again, when you get some rain, those spores are going to leave the apple tree. They're going to splash and blow in the wind farther off back into your cedar trees, technically your juniper trees, okay? And that cycle is going to continue. The alternate host, like I said, is juniper. I get a lot of questions about people asking, if there are about other potential alternate hosts, because sometimes you hear people saying, oh, well, I'll cut down my cedar trees or whatever, and then I won't have to worry about it. We're going to talk about that in a minute. The alternate host is juniper. It is not pine, like pine trees, okay? That is in the Pinus family of plants. It is not an alternate host to cedar apple rust. It's not arborvitae. A lot of people refer to the arborvitae family of plants as white cedar. And so that sometimes leads people to believe that because it's called a white cedar, it could be an alternate host to cedar apple rust. It is not, okay? Arborvitae is technically in what we call the Thuja or Thuya family of plants. It is not a true cedar. It is not a juniper. It's not going to be an alternate host to cedar apple rust. Okay, there are others. I hear people, spruce trees, right? Can spruce trees be an alternate host? No. Spruce trees are in a Picea family. They're not junipers, they're not cedars, and they're not an alternate host. And then there are a couple of oddball ones that again are sometimes quite often called cedars. Things like the weeping Alaskan cedar. Weeping Alaskan cedar is technically a Chamaecyparis. It is Chamaecyparis nootkatensis. It's not a juniper, not a cedar, not a true cedar, not an alternate host. Trying to think of a couple of other, anything in the Chamaecyparis, the false cypress family, and some even your true cedars, like let's say for example a blue atlas cedar. A blue atlas cedar is a true cedar. It is Cedrus atlantica, okay? And it is a true cedar, but it's not a juniper. And it is not a host. It's not the alternate host for cedar apple rust. It's only juniper. And it is predominantly Juniperus virginiana, which is what we always call the northern red cedar. Okay, so I just kind of want to throw that out there just to answer questions. I see a lot of people asking about that. And hopefully that helps to kind of clear this up a bit. Okay, now with that in mind, like I mentioned before, the juniper family of plants is a huge family. There's all kinds of junipers out there, right? Excluding the northern red cedar, right, the Juniperus virginiana, there's a ton of ornamental junipers out there. You know, there's Juniperus procumbens nana, which is a ground cover juniper, and you got your Fitzerianas, and a lot of these things are used ornamentally around houses. They come in all different shapes and sizes. The vast majority of them are probably not going to be an alternate host. Okay, there are a few other species of juniper that can be an alternate host. One of the probably the next most susceptible would be like the what's it called? The Scopulorum. Which are quite often, they're called like the Rocky Mountain juniper. I've heard people call varieties of that skyrocket juniper. They're usually an upright form of juniper, and they usually have a bluish tinge to the needles. They can be an alternate host. I have, on very rare occasions, there was one time where I did find some cedar apple rust galls on a Torolusa juniper. But it was in the prime environment. It was a grouping of Torolusa junipers that were planted right next to a grouping of crab apples, and we had a very wet spring, and like all the key factors were there. And I did see some cedar apple rust galls on those Torolusa junipers, and they did infect the crab apple the following year. I actually had to be a little more aggressive with my spraying, but that's not typically, you're typically not going to find that, but you could. Okay, so you should understand that you could. Any juniper has the potential to be an alternate host for cedar apple rust. Okay, so that's how that works. And I don't want to get too crazy, but I get a lot of people asking about the alternate hosting and how all that pans out. So, how do we control cedar apple rust? Okay, I always talk about cultural controls in my videos. It's something I'm a very big fan of, and I try to utilize on all my properties. Cedar apple rust, you know, the cultural control could be to cut down your cedar trees. I got a couple cedar trees, I'm going to cut them down. Well, you know, that may or may not be effective. The problem with cedar apple rust is that when it's on the junipers and it travels to the apple trees in the springtime, that stuff can travel a really, really long distance. It's not like scab that's going to travel 20 or 30 or 40 yards. This stuff can travel like half a mile, a mile. So I mean, even if your neighbors have cedar trees, if you live in the woods and there's cedar trees out growing wild in the woods, right? I keep saying cedar, I'm referring to the junipers there. You know, by cutting down cedar trees that are on your property, you might reduce some of your disease pressures, but you may not eliminate it because this stuff can travel a really long way. Okay. Another cultural control that I talk about a lot is, you know, just cleaning up, right? Cleaning up, you know, get all the old leaves off of your property, the old fruit mummies off of your property, and, you know, and even that's really not going to be very effective because cedar apple rust is going to leave the leaves on your apple trees long before they fall off the tree. So as much as cultural controls and keeping your orchard floor clean, getting your leaves and your old dead fruit mummies out and all that stuff, that's great for things like scab, okay, and even potentially some of your insect issues, but it's not going to be very effective as a cultural control against cedar apple rust. Pruning can help a little bit. If you prune your trees so that they have a nice open center, okay, you know, the old saying, right, you should be able to take a cat and throw it right through the center of your apple tree, right? That can be helpful, again, because what that will do is that will create an environment where when your trees get wet, they will dry up a little bit faster. Having good sunlight penetration, good air circulation, it can help, but it's probably not going to solve the issue. So with all that in mind, we're going to get through good stuff here. The spraying. How do you spray in order to keep cedar apple rust from being a nuisance in your orchard? Fortunately, cedar apple rust has a relatively short period of infection, unlike, let's say, apple scab, okay? And at this point, I'm going to kind of throw this out there. If you live in an environment where you deal with apple scab and cedar apple rust, if you watch my video on apple scab, and I would recommend that you do, because scab is more of an issue on apples, in my opinion, than rust is. If you have a spray program in place that will keep your scab in check, you will also keep your rust in check. And the reason for that is that scab has this very long window throughout the growing season where it can infect your trees. Cedar apple rust is going to have a much smaller window right in the middle of your scab window. So if you're spraying to control your scab, your rust is going to get caught right in the middle of that spray program, and you should be able to control both at once, okay? If you live in an area where scab is not an issue, but rust is, this is the way you want to deal with it. Rust is going to move from the junipers onto your apple trees. Once your apple trees start to leaf out a little bit, okay, and once the temperatures get up around 60 degrees and you get a good substantial rain, that's what's going to activate these galls that are on the junipers. You can see them if you go out, you know, in the springtime after a good rain. They look like these weird, like gelatinous, orange colored jellyfish things that are hanging off of your junipers. That's the juniper end of that disease getting ready to start putting out their spores. Okay, so that's when you're going to want to start your spray program. As soon as your trees start to leaf out a little bit, the spring's coming, temperatures get up around 60 degrees or so, you're watching the weather, and if they call for a good rain, you want to get your sprays out before that rain comes. If you've watched my other videos regarding, you understand, these fungicides, they work preventatively. Most of them do not work curatively. So you have to get that fungicide spray out before that rain event so that you have protection in place so that when those spores try to go from the junipers onto your apple trees, they can't infect your apple trees. Okay? For something like that, I would recommend Mancozeb. Mancozeb is a good product. It's very good at controlling cedar apple rust. Another one is Spectricide. is the brand. Okay, Spectracide makes a product called Immunox. The active ingredient in it is called myclobutanil. That works pretty darn well against cedar apple rust also. And if you have a really bad problem with cedar apple rust, you can actually mix the two together. You can mix the Immunox with the Mancozeb, and that kind of gives you like a 1-2 punch. And you want to start your sprays, like I said, in the spring when the trees start to leaf out, before the rain comes. And the window of opportunity where cedar apple rust can get into your apple trees is, it can start as early as when the trees first start pushing out leaves, when you have, we call them half-inch green or something like that, right? Half-inch green, around that time frame. As soon as they start to push out tiny little bits of green leaves, they can potentially get infected if you have the right temperatures and the right rainfall amounts. And that window of opportunity is going to go right through until probably petal fall, when the flower petals are actually falling off of the trees. And the most susceptible time, when it is most potentially going to get onto your apple trees, is during what we call tight cluster and pink. Those are the time frames where typically you've got a good amount of foliage on your trees, so it's easy for those spores to find them. And you're typically late enough in the springtime where the temperatures are going to be just right, and you're going to have potentially your spring rains. So you have all the key factors together, okay, that can create for an infection. So those are the time periods you really want to focus on. Now the number of sprays that you need to make, typically these fungicides will give you control for maybe 10 days. Okay, I would say anywhere from 10 to 14, 10 to 16 days. It's going to depend on how much rain you get. If you get a lot of rain after that first application, you might only get 10 or 12 days of control out of it, right? If you only have a couple little rain events, whatever, you might get 14 days. It's kind of a gut feeling kind of a thing. Okay, and the number of sprays that you need to make and how aggressive you have to be with your spray program is a big part of that is going to depend on the amount of disease pressures that you're dealing with. Okay, because there's so many different variables involved. The variety of apple tree that you grow. Some apple trees are somewhat resistant to cedar apple rust. Okay, some can be very prone to it. The amount of junipers that you have on your property or on your neighbor's property, right? That's going to increase or decrease your disease pressure. And how much rainfall you get in that time span in the spring. When you have that window, if you get a lot of rain in that little window between, green tip and petal fall, and specifically around tight cluster and pink, if you get a lot of rainfall, you're going to be dealing with more disease pressures. So there are a few variables that are going to kind of help to decide how aggressive you need to be with your spray program. And part of it is going to be just time. Part of it is going to be getting to know your trees. Every single tree is different. Every single orchard is different. I've got accounts that I've been working on for 15 years. And so I know, okay, I don't have a big problem with scab here, or I don't have a big problem with rust here, but I have a really big issue with rust on this account. You kind of feel out your trees. You feel out the situation in your particular environment, and that also will help to decide just how aggressive you need to be with your spray program in order to keep these things in check. Now, if you want to go the more organic route, I will say that cedar apple rust, I think, is easier to deal with organically than scab is. Scab is the killer when it comes to trying to be organic. Cedar apple rust can be managed organically. You can use copper sprays. Copper is somewhat effective against rust. You don't want to spray copper once your trees get into the pink stage, because if you start applying copper too late into the year, you could end up with russeted fruit, right? In fact, a lot of people say that they won't even run copper after the tight cluster stage of development. Because even at that point you can run into russeting. So you can use copper early in the season, right? keeping an eye on the weather conditions and such, timing your sprays right before that rain comes. But you don't want to go too far into the growing season with that, because you can russet your fruit. Now, I have heard from colleagues of mine who I trust that they've had good results using a biological fungicide called Serenade. Serenade is a biological fungicide. It is all organic, it is all natural, and I've heard that it can be relatively darn effective against cedar apple rust. It's not very effective against scab, but I've heard that it is effective against rust, and so that's something you could look into, you could try. Serenade, I forget exactly what the beneficial bacteria is in it. I don't recall offhand. But I do know that on the commercial level, it sells under the name Serenade to like a homeowner situation. You might find it in a local garden center or hardware store. I'm sure you can find it online if you look online. On the more commercial level, it goes by the name Cease, C-E-A-S-E. So if you're dealing with a larger scale orchard and you want to get a little more bang for your buck, you can buy it in like 1 gallon or 2 gallon containers under the name Cease. And it's the same biological product, it's just packaged differently in a different name. So you could try those options from an organic standpoint to try to get some control. And like I said, I've heard they can work. But that's not going to give you control over scab. The copper can help with scab earlier in the season, but I have not heard any good things about using Serenade or Cease as far as scab control goes for the later on sprays. So I hope that kind of clarified a few things. Like I said, I just get a lot of people asking questions specifically regarding the alternate host thing and how that works. And hopefully this answered your questions. If you have any others, leave them in the comments below. I think I'm going to start making some videos where I'm answering some questions. I got some really good questions in my comments on some of my videos. And if it's a comment, I do read them. I want you guys to know I do read my comments. And if it is a comment or a question that I can answer relatively easily, I will just type out an answer for you if it's not too long-winded. But sometimes I get questions where the answer is a lot, and I don't want to sit there and write out 10 paragraphs. But I think I'm going to start making some videos where I'm going to be answering some of these questions in video form and just putting them out there. So if you have any other questions, please leave them in the comments. And like I said, if I can answer it quickly and simply for you, I will. If not, I may end up making a video about it. I hope this helps. I hope this video is helpful for you guys. I hope that you can grow your fruit trees cedar apple rust free and scab free, so you can make some apple pies and applesauce and pick some apples with your grandkids. That's what I'm looking for this year. And I don't know, hopefully it helps. Happy spring. Spring is coming, and I'm getting ready for the crazy season. Take care, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.